beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my very dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On this show, we're talking about being students on the embodied spiritual path. And what does that mean? What's a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. And we're attempting to sort that out for ourselves here on the show. Last week, we started to talk about relating to fear, and then Vanessa's power went out, and we had a cliffhanger on our hands about what tools we use to deconstruct fear. Well, as it turns out, we had a lot more to say about fear because we did a whole deeper layer episode on it. Okay, so fear is going to arise in a human life, and we don't need to make it bad. And we also don't need to put on the blinders or try the Pollyanna approaches. As it turns out, these things don't really work. They just condense and thicken the fear in our systems. So when fear does arise, and it usually comes on like a freight train and is totally consuming, how do we unhook it in the most honest and tender and useful way? It can require a shocking amount of courage to relate with fear. And yet when we do it, it is very potent alchemy for our lives. There's actually a great deal of good news in the fear. Considering world events, it's worth mentioning the timing that Vanessa and I recorded this episode on Election Day in the United States before the tally was in. And you'll hear me get into that a little bit in this episode, my feelings on that. It's not a political show. So if you're starting to bristle about that, that's not what's up. We just finished recording next week's episode where you'll get to hear us and me, since it's a triggering issue for me in particular, working through very raw fear in real time as we do the show. So you can think of this as a part 2 to last week and a part 1 to next week. If you're enjoying the show, we would be totally delighted if you left a review on iTunes. It helps us to know how we're doing, and it also helps other people to find out that the show exists and to grow what we hope will be a nice and nourishing community over time, and is already very much shaping up that way in a really sweet way. One last note before we head into the conversation. We have potty mouths a little bit, so wear headphones if you don't want anyone in the room hearing those words. Okay, here we go.
Well, hello there, Brooke.
Hello.
Well, this is our conversation on fear, part 2.
So French.
Very French, because, wow, I don't know, 2 times in a row somehow. Well, not exactly in a row, but we wound up doing part 2. So maybe this is a new thing for us. Who knows? But I did have the luxury of listening to our last conversation on fear in between when we recorded that and this particular moment where we're recording this. And I thought it was really interesting. And it's fascinating to hear us in process, because we were actually like very much in process. It's actually funny listening to yourself, right? Like in process, because you're like, where am I going with this?
Totally. Yeah.
I don't even know. And so, at the end of the conversation, you'll hear me say that this is a cliffhanger because the universe kind of hung up on us right as we were.
That's right. Your power went out.
Yeah, my power just went out very inconveniently, and for long enough that we could not recover.
Right.
Right as we were moving into the tools portion, that how do we wrap this up with a nice
tidy bow? Hooray!
Yeah. So. A couple things we could take from that. I do want to, of course, talk about, how we deal with fear, how we're interacting with it and relating to it in a tools and practices sort of way. But also it got me thinking that maybe we just didn't complete this conversation. I mean, if we're going to pose the question, is everything in life a movement of fear or love? I think maybe we had better talk about it a little more.
Or forever for the rest of our days. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is it. And it does come up kind of in every conversation. If you all listening can hear, you can hear the movements of fear and love and limitation versus abundance. You can, really hear them throughout our dialogues. But at the end of our conversation, I really felt like I got somewhere. I finally had a...
Well, that's how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, for me. But so I thought maybe we could just kick off again. expanding on the conversation of fear, also versus clarity and love, whatever word we feel most comfortable using, how we can identify that, how we can show up with it. And then we can start to talk a little more about how we're dealing with it as this comes up in our human form.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I re-listened to that one too, mostly because honestly, it felt so raw when we recorded it that I had to listen to it to decide if I wanted it to be published or not. I was like, ooh, I brought up some close to the bone stuff, and I brought it up while I'm figuring this out, which I still am. It's not like now I've got it on lock, But no, I felt like it was actually, when I re-listened to it, a great conversation. And the place that we kind of meandered to towards the end was this very big concept of, as long as we have a sense of I, which most of us do, and as long as we have an ego identity, then there will be fear. And we're not trying to make, like, there are no wrong things. Like, it's not like we're trying to make fear bad, or, that everyone has to have the goal of like completely eradicating their individual sense of ego identity. But I think that's probably a good jumping off point, is as long as we, until we really know, 100% can't get back in the box, know that we are God, which we don't. I'm not advertising that that's where I'm at. I'm not. Then we're going to have fear. Fear's going to arise. That's just a part of the human condition. However, we have lots of ways of relating to it differently so that it doesn't make us its bitch. until we know we're God, it's like,
that's right.
Right.
We're not doomed by it. That doesn't have to be, this horrible news. We don't have to collapse into, oh, okay, so now the rest of my life, I'm just going to be this fearful person. There's this loosening that can happen. There are these real unbindings of constrictions that can happen. There's greater and greater levels of freedom that can happen. I think when we look at it from that lens, one of the things that I guess is useful to drive home is that, hey, look, you're human, and shit is crazy, and shit is scary, and shit is unpredictable. And as long as we're operating from that lens, that reality of I am a human, and this is a form that I want to maintain, and this is a material world that I'm existing in, from that level, we're just always going to have some. So then fear doesn't have to be a problem. It doesn't have to be something I make wrong or that I make bad, right? Mm-hmm. And that alone can give a little looseness. So I guess, I want to share like a smarty pants thought and then expand it a little bit. So my smarty pants thought is that, as we got to this epiphany at the end of the talk, which is hilarious when you get to epiphanies, because you're like, okay, duh.
Yeah, I know, it's always a duh. It's always like, well, yeah, it sounds dumb when I say it now.
You're like, oh, okay, as long as
felt like a big light bulb at the time.
Why it sounds dumb is because this truth has been around forever. Right. So the truth has been around forever, but that's how epiphanies work. I mean, I work with people all day long. The way we have epiphanies is like something expands, like there's a pop or an aha where it arises from, for lack of a better way of saying it, like arises from like a deeper place, not just a cognitive push.
Yes.
Like this makes sense. So I'm going to believe this, but rather, oh shit, this is how things work.
Yeah.
So a lot of what you have epiphanies about when you're in therapy or in conversation or in all sorts of different paths, they seem like no-brainers, right? Well, why it seems like a no-brainer is if we just reflect back, Buddhist, Brooke and I both have Buddhist lineages, and so we're informed by Buddhist thinking in some fashion. And this is what Buddha was always saying. He didn't harp on the word fear. That wasn't his harp. Like he didn't also harp on the word love. But what he basically said is that as long as we see ourselves as separate, as long as we identify with this form, Vanessa Scotto, as me, then we will experience fear. in that fear because we are vulnerable, because in that state we are temporal, right? So as we see ourselves as separate, we are alone and we are at risk. And so we will naturally feel fear. And he really prescribed the antidote. The practices are different, but the antidote was to recognize that you're not separate, that you are everything, that you are one with everything, right? Now, the practices of how to get there, a lot of traditions have them and they vary. And Buddha actually had very specific practices that he was espousing to have that realization of who you really are and what it's really all about. So basically, this has been shared, and I'm sure in many ways, I'm sure Hindu traditions have their own idea about this because you're really God, but you don't know, and you have to remember. I'm sure it exists across time and across the world. This idea that, okay, up until that point, we are identified with form, aka my body, aka this material reality. And in this, things are unpredictable, aren't they?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And that's scary. And I can be hurt, like you and I have spoken before. Maybe in a way, there's a certain luxury with ignorance. Like if you haven't seen some bad shit, there's this certain way of engaging with life where you kind of can just have these blinders onto it. It's like you just know life is wonderful and abundant and people are kind and, but if you've been through some stuff, if you've seen stuff, it's like you can't unsee it. And you just know, like, that's not going to cut it. Like the blinder approach is not going to cut it. And the Pollyanna approach is not going to cut it. This world's got some fucked up things in it. And so I can't relate by denying. I know that this world has some things that can be very difficult for my psyche and for my form. So then from that perspective, how do I deal? Not in denial, not in Pollyanna.
Right.
How do I be with it?
Yeah. I know we both have lots of thoughts as a response to that. But I feel like one of the key things for me, well, first of all, is just starting to think of fear a little differently. So awareness, right? Basic awareness, because oftentimes fear comes on so fast and so hard, like it's so loud and in your face and telling you that you will die if you don't pay attention to it, that you don't realize. I don't realize that I'm consumed by it until I'm long since consumed by it. So one of the things that's been helpful for me is realizing when I'm on the train of fear, the like no brakes on the train. And it's so, again, like it's one of those things that has been talked about for millennia, but the simple act of awareness unhooks huge parts of it. It's not that I'm not still feeling fear, and it's not that my ego mind, which is still running my show because I'm not enlightened, isn't still telling me that I'm afraid and I'm at risk and this is why you should be afraid and you should really pay attention. But if I can suddenly just have this moment where I go, oh, like I'm on the runaway train of fear, just the noticing, just the awareness, suddenly I get to have this shift. It's seeing it from a different perspective. Instead of it being me, where I'm completely consumed by it, it's a thing that's alive and happening within me. And me is something bigger than just the fear, just being puppeteered by this terror, So that is like the first unhook for all of us is just aware, and like maybe, and then the second part is maybe I have to introduce just a little bit to this fear that feels completely true and completely consuming. I have to introduce the idea like, can I absolutely know that it's true? Is it actually true? Which is the Byron Katie question that I just love. Can you absolutely know that that's true? And then it unhooks a little bit more and it's like, and your answer might be yes. your answer might be from that place of like, hell yes, I know it's true because blah, 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 blah. Like, here's all the evidence that fear is going to present, which is also fine. But just the process of gaining a little, that you are not just your thoughts, and your thoughts are not always true, and you are not just this sensation of consumed by fear, and here's all the evidence why I should. Just that is a lifelong practice and endlessly freeing. And I don't mean that in a Pollyanna way now that I understand that, fear isn't always true, well, then I just don't feel it anymore. That's not the case at all. Like, and in many ways, I would say that for me with this path, the more I kind of unhook, the more it actually rushes through my system in a much, like, the visceral sense of it is actually clearer. I kind of feel it more. But because I have this other, wiring, this other code I've been writing, that it's not me, it just helps. It's still very uncomfortable, but it starts a different kind of process, different kind of conversation with it. And then, at a certain point, way down the road, and sometimes I can get excited. I can be like, oh, terror. Hi, terror. I know you. What gift are you bringing me this time? Like, when we do the dance this time, what fresh insight will I have on the other side of it? And that's on the other side of it because I'm still in the dance, and in the dance still feels like I'm going to die. So just the hanging out with the I'm going to die, but I'm not dying, is a big deal practice.
Okay, you just said a mouthful.
A little bit. I know. I'm like, stop, Brooke, stop speaking of freight trains. Too far, too much.
Middle, it's going so deep, and you can't stop it. You can't stop it. Can't stop, don't stop. But let's break some of it down because there's some nuggets in there, and maybe we can highlight them. So the first thing you spoke about was the power of awareness. And I actually just spoke about that with 2 clients today because, we wonder how to heal. Like, how many of us have been taught how to heal, how to work with fear, how to work with love, how to communicate? Like, we weren't really taught. And then if it wasn't modeled for us, looks like everyone else has figured this out. We don't know who to ask. We go about like not understanding, like, I'm really hurt. How does one do this? How does one heal? How does one face fear? So I was just talking about it with a couple of clients this morning that awareness really is that first step. Awareness seems so simple, because a lot of people will come in, let's say they're coming for coaching, and they'll say to me, I already know what the problem is, right? Like, let's say, for example, one of the things I've spoken about on the show is I feel unlovable. Okay. So I can walk into my therapist's office and I can say, well, I know I'm unlovable, and I can even trace back and identify why. My mother was like this, or my father was like that. And then this happened to me with, my first love of my life. And, I can identify it. So from that perspective, I feel like, well, I understand what's up, right? So why isn't anything changing?
Right. The cognitive piece is happening. So can we wrap it up now?
Why haven't I gotten over it?
Yeah.
Now I hate myself because I haven't gotten over it, which means it proves I'm shitty and, all that wonderful spiral. But awareness isn't really just that. There is a piece that's, of course, cognitive. It's like understanding your narrative, how each dot connected and like what that created in you. It's a piece, but an epiphany really is, and they show this through neuroscience, it's like a mind, body, spirit. It's like everything clicks. It all lines up. And that's why it feels like, whoa, breakthrough, even though it sounds pretty simple. Like I had an ex-boyfriend who had a breakthrough in therapy, and his breakthrough was like, oh my God, my parents' relationship is causing my commitment issues.
Right.
And I'm like, did you not know that?
Isn't that Psych 101? But no, like when you viscerally, like every cell, all of your trillions of cells lights up and is like, I get it now. That's a big deal. Like the knowing.
Yes, that's everything. And it's why people can't just tell you things.
No,
and that's
right.
why, like, when you and I talk about ripeness, it's like, if it's ripe for you, Brooke, and I offer you insight, it may like provoke an epiphany.
Yeah.
Because there was a readiness and a ripeness, and all I had to do is kind of like give you that little nudge to go there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not ripe and ready, and that epiphany is not ready to be born on a level of like mind, body, spirit, I can give all sorts of wonderful insights and it will mean nothing. You know, it will shift nothing. And in fact, you'll probably just use it to beat yourself up because you can't get there somehow. So awareness, when we say that, is like this really clear aha. And that's why it feels like that, like, holy, oh my God, as if your eyes have been opened or your energy has been moved. That kind of awareness changes things. It just changes things. It's like no more than that. No effort, no striving, no fixing, no to-do list, no practices, just
right. Yep.
like awareness. And then something like organically shifts. And that's what's really beautiful when you see how you can organically shift, because the truth heals.
Amen.
So there's that.
Yep.
Amen. So, okay. So awareness from that level, that's the awareness that Brooke's talking about. Am I projecting? Is that what you're talking about?
I am talking about that. I might refine it a little more as like a step one is literally just, can you feel the fear? And instead of it consuming you, it's like you're watching it like it's a movie. Step one, awareness. And then the step two is, once you can unhook that way, is you have what you're describing, which is like the knowing.
Okay, great. So what I was thinking when you were talking about in this case, you use the movie, but prior you were saying like you recognize you're bigger than the feeling.
Yes.
You're like larger than the feeling. So I was thinking about, embodied psychology 101 is you learn to stay with your feelings. That's embodied psychology 101. You make space for your feelings to exist. This is something like John Wellwood taught me, I don't know how many years ago now, 10, 15 years ago. You stay, because we're actually afraid of ourselves so often. Forget life. Like, we're afraid of a lot of things in life, but like, we're afraid that we can't handle our feelings. We're afraid we're bad. We're afraid that we don't know what we'll find if we go in there. Like, can we handle it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. At the end of the day, I think the only thing we're afraid of is ourselves, but that's at the end of the day. It doesn't feel like that's what's true until you get there and you're like, oh.
Yeah. Oh, there is only us. So, okay. Yes. Okay. We'll come back to that. But so we're afraid of ourselves. So the first step, as you just described this point in awareness, as I've also experienced it, is like, can I just stay? That's what meditation is, right? We just stay with whatever thoughts, whatever feelings, whatever urges arise. We just stay. Well, from embodied psychology, it's like a feeling's arising. Maybe it's fear. We just stay with it. We don't try to do anything about it. We don't try to fix it.
Yeah.
We don't try to repress it. We don't manage it.
Mm-hmm.
We just stay and breathe. Like, as if you and I right now were doing an eye gazing exercise and we just looked deep into each other's eyes, and it can get a little like, oh, we just stay.
Mm-hmm.
We breathe and we don't avoid it. We don't do anything with it. And that's the first step, because we're not really accustomed to that with our emotions.
No.
We either feed them or repress them.
Yup. And you don't realize until you start practicing, like, wow, I really haven't been feeling my feelings, and I really haven't been staying in the moment kind of ever, when you begin the process of this, of learning this.
Yeah. And some people, instead of staying, they repress, like you and I would probably go towards that. We'll just stuff it into the body and make ourselves sick.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And then there's other people who, because they can't stay with it, they discharge it. So that looks like anger. It looks like violence. It looks like anxiety. Like when someone's like panicking and they're just oozing like anxiety out of their pores.
Yeah.
And you're absorbing it. Okay. But so we learn not to do either of those, but just to stay and to breathe and to be present with. And what's interesting is we develop trust that we can meet our feelings. Like we don't have to be afraid of ourselves. And in some ways, since feelings can be unpredictable, we don't have to be afraid of what's unpredictable. It's like a really powerful exercise. And in that, I think part of what you get is what you were saying earlier. This idea that Buddhists would say, you are the sun and your feelings and thoughts are like clouds. They pass through, they pass by, but they don't change you. That was their way of languaging what you said before, like, you're more than these feelings. So I used to have clients, sometimes they'd sit with their feelings, and because I'm empathic, I can feel a taste of their feelings. And sometimes the feelings were so freaking big. I understood why they weren't staying. Like,
yes,
it was a feat to stay with that. So then in those cases, and this was rare, but it did happen, what I would do is have them get bigger. Have them imagine themselves, like feel themselves expand so that the relative ratio of feeling to self could change, because then we realize we have more room to kind of hold the intensity of this big experience. So I don't know, but that was just what I was thinking of about this, like step one of awareness, as you were saying, is like, depending on what we've been through in our life, you know, the fear can be something old.
Yep.
And it can really be like, I am dying. Like I will fall into a million pieces and die. And so there's this way that it's like, I think of it like we have to kind of titrate it to stay, like kind of like opening a pressure cooker. If I just turn the knob on this like pressure valve and like let a little out and have a lot of patience and a lot of compassion and stay as long as we can. And in this process, we make more space, we release, and we also build more muscles so that we can stay longer next time.
Yeah, I love that, because the way we do one thing is the way we do everything, right? And I think that a lot of us who are maybe consumed by large emotions, or just generally in this cultural moment where we're all really, really hard on ourselves, that we can go into these kinds of practices with a ferocity that is not loving, you know, like I'm going to tear it all out. I want it all out now. I want it all gone. And that's just really self-injurious behavior, you know? So that titration idea is so helpful. Like, can you just treat yourself the way you would treat your newborn baby in your arms? Like, sweetie pea, you know, like just adorning with kisses and like, oh, just that kind of very big, expansive, soft love. You know, you'd never yell at your newborn like, come on, get it together. No,
it's like telling someone who's really afraid, like to do something they're really afraid of while they feel their fear. You know, it's like we're creating compounding dilemmas.
Exactly.
And so how can we approach ourselves differently? It's like, so, recently, I worked with this woman. Her name's Dr. Ann Jensen, to be included in resources. And she's a chiropractor, but she worked with like muscle testing a lot. And I've told you about her. So her work is really no storyline, no narrative whatsoever. She says the issues get stored in the tissues. She's really along that line of somatic experiencing. So what she does is she helps you identify where you're holding emotion in your body still, and then helps you go into a movement, like an actual movement, to start to release these emotions. So, you know, I've long known that I've dealt with anger from my childhood. Well, anger is an understatement. Let's just say, let's own what it is, which was rage, a ton of fear, certainly disgust, shame, you know, let's just say I've had every emotion. But let's say anger and fear maybe were some of the more predominant ones. So, you know, I go through these sessions and I'm releasing it. And the craziest thing, it's like let's say with fear, she'll have you kind of bundle up, like, get into a ball and like put your arms over your head and like really crunch in, if you could all imagine that, like the way someone would want to do if they were afraid and there was no societal right or wrong, or, you didn't think you had to like look someone in the eye. It's just, you want to like curl in. So you go ahead and you do it and you stay like that until you don't want to stay like that anymore, which you think will be never. Right?
Yes,
like,
right. When you first go in, you're like, I'm good. I'm going to be here for the rest of my life.
I mean, if I'm going to lean into what we fear is that if I lean into fear, if I lean into grief, if I lean into anger, they'll never pass.
Yes.
Right. I'm going to like collapse in them. They're going to own me. Like I'll be their bitch, like you said before. So, you do it and then all of a sudden, you're done. And this can happen over, many, many different things because there's all these different memories that are stored in your tissue. So it's not just like a one-stop emotional shop. It's like where it's held based on what moment in your life. And it's really profound work. And one of the things I got out of that is that it's like if you were to imagine a bucket and you were to imagine all of the emotion that you have repressed and stored in your system, all of this unprocessed experience, and you were to fill the bucket up with it. You can imagine for some of us, that's overflowing already. And then it just takes a little more from life and the emotions are just flowing. And then people are like, why are you being so extreme? Or why are you so afraid? Right? Like you mentioned last time, it's like, you're just in bed with your dog.
Right. Why are you consumed by this despair? Yeah.
Right. Like what's happening? Why are you afraid? And and it seems unusual. And to other people, it could even seem too much. Like it's too much. It's too much, which of course we understand rationally. It's too much for the circumstance. But what I've come to experience for myself is what's happening is I'm so loaded with years of this emotion that's stored, with years of this energy that's stored, that my bucket's like overflowing. So, we have to be very thoughtful and mindful about how to engage with that to kind of empty the bucket, so to speak. It doesn't help to be mad that a bucket exists. It doesn't help to say the bucket shouldn't exist. It doesn't help to judge ourselves, right? All of those things we do, they really don't help. But what helps is like very slowly and mindfully and thoughtfully and caringly and compassionately, so we don't add more emotion and karma to our system by abusing ourselves, we can start to release this. And that's where we can get more freedom, because even though we're human and you and I still know we're in form, even though we have pops of, I'm so much more than this, even from this place, we still don't have to be suffering with the emotional loads that we're suffering with and with the belief systems that are stirring those pots.
Yeah. And just to be super practical, because fear does arise for all of us. I think that, and also, I don't want this to feel disheartening to people. Like I'm going to have to titrate out my giant overflowing bucket for the rest of my life. It's like, which in a certain way is kind of like, what's up? But it doesn't have that feeling. Like that's just fear telling a story about fear, right? It's like,
no, it actually feels great because
exactly.
A, it's a bucket. So it is a finite amount, actually. Not that we can't have new fear, but all of this stored shit, it is finite. Like you can actually empty that bucket, and B, there's hope. You can empty your bucket.
Right.
Like,
oh, hey, rejoice. You can empty your bucket. That's our new bumper sticker.
It means nothing to no one.
I know. That's why it's so great. But to be super practical, what I was going to say is like when it happens, the fear or the big emotion that is the thing that plays through your life that you hate, trying to really, 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 really get to the present moment, because fear also pushes way ahead. It tells catastrophic future tense stories, and it also tells sad, fondling the darkness past tense stories. Vanessa just made a face at me on Skype for fondling the darkness. I fucking love that's such a perfect phrase. I was an emo goth girl growing up. Fondling the darkness makes sense to me. That was my whole adolescence.
The fondle I don't love that much.
Yeah, sorry. But instead of getting bounced back and forth between the tenses, just in the moment, what would feel just like the most loving thing you could do? Genuinely loving. So again, not like necessarily I want an ice cream sundae, though it might be that, but it's probably going to be something that doesn't feel like what your conditioning wants you to do. Like, today I really just want to take a nap. And then your conditioning says, come on, today's a very busy day. You know that, blah, 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 and like all the stories. But really trying to get to that the moment you're in right now. Like I'm sitting in a chair, I'm consumed with dread. What would be a loving thing to do? And it's like, exhale, get a glass of water, whatever the actual genuine thing is, because there's no script. So it's what is going to work for the person. Maybe in that moment, it would feel good to meditate. Maybe it would feel like being put in a cage with a tiger in that moment to meditate, and it doesn't feel good. And instead, just stepping out your front door and looking off in the horizon and seeing sunshine is what feels good. Those little softenings in the present tense that are born of love for yourself and of knowing that you're bigger than the feeling, that you can actually access the support web of whatever, the glass of water, the looking at the sunshine, the exhale, whatever, I think starts to make these hard patterns soften and make them more workable. And it's just a very, very practical thing to do. It requires actually a shocking amount of courage and also a shocking amount of self-awareness. You really start to realize how much conditioning rules the day. I start to realize how much conditioning rules the day when I have to answer the simple question of what would actually feel nourishing and supportive right now. And my brain starts going like telling me shoulds and shouldn'ts and ought tos and maybes and I don't know. But that's the stuff, that's the work. It's good, juicy stuff there.
For people who say, because I hear this a lot, like, well, I don't know how to love myself, or I don't love myself, So it almost like as soon as you hear the word loving can come up with like, it can trigger a narrative for someone to say, oh, but I don't know how to love myself, or I don't do that. And if that's the case, if you can't move with the word love for yourself, you can also look at where's my safety at? Where's safety at for me right now? Mm-hmm. And what feels safe, and you can work with that, because I see that sometimes if I even say to someone it's an act of self-love, it's like, wait, but I don't love myself. And, there can already be like a wound can get activated. It is loving. It is loving. Basically, you're moving away from buying into the fear conditioning by creating safety. Right? It's like a nap would feel replenishing, or, this glass of water would give me some ease, right? It's like, I'm calming my system, through these different motions. But it also, you can think about like, where's safety at? Like, I just realized talking to someone today that we didn't all understand where to find safety. It's like, I don't think I was taught to find safety inside of me. Like we talked last week when we talked about fear, we talked about the am I okay voice. Like,
right.
Okay?
Am I okay? Yeah.
Okay. And I had that same voice. So I always had the voice that would say, am I okay? Am I okay? And then I would respond with, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. And then I always wanted someone to tell me, you're going to be okay. Right. And so I'd go to therapy. I went into therapy, and that was like a very sincere wish of mine, like to have that kind of wise person. My mother is wonderful, but she had a lot of anxiety. And again, anxiety is the voice of, I don't know if we're going to be okay. Right. Yeah. So she wasn't really that place that I could go to. So I was always wishing I had someone who would just say, it's going to be okay, Vanessa. It's going to be okay. But at the time when I went to therapy, I'm already 33, and I'm a very aware and smart woman. And I realize in this world of form, everything's not always okay. Shit happens, and painful shit happens, even to good people, right? It just happens. And so now I realize, like, I want someone to tell me I'm going to be okay, but that's not going to work anymore, because I know it's not true that like necessarily everything is going to be quote unquote okay.
Yeah.
So I was like, where do I go with this? Where do I go with this? And where I realized is what I could mean by okay, if I just went a little deeper, was that essentialness was always going to be okay, untouched. I would always love, I could always laugh, I could always find my heart again, I could always find my body, in that larger view that you're talking about, that I could be okay. When we go through heartbreak, let's say we have a breakup and you think, I'm never going to be okay again. Well, that's what I think. I don't know what you all think, but like when I went through my divorce and you think I'm never going to be okay again. And part of that, I'm never going to be okay again was like, I don't know if I'll ever love. I don't know if I'll ever trust. I may never be that happy, carefree soul. It's like all of these things that mean not okay. And I came to see like, I will be okay. Because I is okay. Because I is fundamentally always okay. So from there, I understood like, that's safety. That's the only safety there is. It's like, there's no way in this world of form we could say, oh, Brooke, you're going to be safe. Just dress a certain way or like,
right.
Don't hang out with certain people, right?
Yeah.
It's like, because that's nonsense. We know that's not true, right? There's more to this story than we understand. And that idea that I can find safety outside makes me hyper vigilant and hyper managing of every variable. So I feel like no one ever taught us where safety is and how to resource within ourselves for that. And that's what a lot of these movements can be, is like, well, where's safety in me right now? Like, how can I reestablish that? How can I learn to trust myself by staying with it, but also learn that if I can't stay with it, I could take a break and like have that all be okay.
Yeah. I think that it makes sense maybe to talk about a little bit the good news of fear, because we don't want to get caught, as we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, in making it bad, or that it needs to be eradicated, or that it can be, that you can have a fear-free life. That's not what we're trying to sell. But there is good news about fear, so for me, I have to go into an example, and I'm going to use what I'm currently processing, which, the fear kind of quote unquote went away. I felt like the sky for a long time. And then it's election day, so it's perfect to talk about. The current US election came up, and it was just perfectly crafted to ping on my exact pain body about feeling safe in the world, and about sociopathy, and about abusive power, and about war, and about, I'm not in control of my own life. There are these other people that are going to, wreck everything, and about hate and fanning the flame, just all this stuff. So it was perfect. It was like this most perfectly crafted, the world out there event to really start hammer on my particular pain body. So fear arises. I'm consumed. I'm obsessed. It's like genuinely like self-injurious behavior, watching the feeds and reading the articles, just like, hit me again, like hit me some more, like hit it. Like
Trump.
Exactly. I wasn't going to say the name, but yeah. And it's just like, I'm consumed. Like I'm not sleeping. And I went to this place, like way out place, where I was like, I was just weeping with my partner, and I was saying to him, what if we're the worst? Like, what if our species is just the worst? Like, what if we imagine God as this personified other, which we know is not the case, but like, let's imagine Old Testament personified other God. And he comes along and he goes, creation, I am so sorry, but I'm going to make this thing called human beings, and they are the worst. They're the worst. Like squirrels, I love what you're up to. Birds, you got it going on. Grass, keep doing what you're doing. And I am so sorry, because these ones, the worst. But I got to do it.
Made it.
Yeah, made a huge mistake. And I'm just like talking to my partner. I'm just like weeping. I'm like, what if we're really like so I get to the point where I'm way out on the ledge, where I'm like, my whole species is the worst.
Yeah, you're totally worked up.
Right. That's when you're in that obsessive grip, it's actually such great news. It feels like hell, But it's such great news because what it's saying is there are some seeds in here that are ripe. Like there is a harvest here for you. Each individual's thing that's going to get pinged on perfectly is going to be different. For me, feeling safe in the world, big deal stuff. So this was like perfectly crafted US election for me to just be like, oh crap, like I have to harvest all that stuff. But it has been so beautiful because first, I know enough by now to know if I'm obsessed and consumed by the fear, there's something to harvest out of the pain body. Okay. Got it. And not cognitively, but experientially. And so I have to just keep like sitting with it, feeling it. And it with a wide variety of like what feels like the next best thing to do. There was a lot of just being in bed and sleeping, which didn't feel like depressive kind of being in bed. It felt like genuine, nourishing sleep. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of looking at the world in a loving way. There was a lot of leaning into what do we call enemies and what do we all want as humans? Like I've had to, and I continue to come home to this real love of humanity and feeling really safe because we're all just the little droplets of God. We're all just playing our right role. And I don't mean this in a silver lined way because it continues to unfold for me, but then you start to find things like resources, right? So then the next right thing to do, up pops a podcast with, Sounds True. It was Krista Tippett on Insights at the Edge with Tammy Simon. I didn't think that was going to have anything to do with how I felt about the US election, but I listened to it and it just felt like this huge flood of relief. So then I'm wandering around. I was in California recently, a bookstore, and I find her book that they were being interviewed, Becoming Wise. I'm like, oh, this would be perfect plain reading. And it was just like this nectar. It was the just right balm for my soul. It's not going to be the just right balm for everyone's soul, but it was like only because I could feel like lean into the little nuggets of like, this feels good over here. This is maybe like green light, warm, yummy feelings over here on this resource. And I get nectar and I get, so right now I'm in process on coming home to feeling safe in the world, feeling love for the species, feeling love for all of humanity. And that's in process. But like, that's the good news of fear is that when we do figure out ways to dance with it, is it still unpleasant? Yes. Would I rather that I had a magic wand? Maybe. I don't know. But there's definitely goodness to be harvested as opposed to just learning how to tolerate it or learning how to make it go away, In
Tantric Buddhism, they think of every emotion as being alchemical.
Yes.
Like they're all just messengers and there's God in all of them. So they think of it all being alchemical and something essential, like something rising up from the primordial. Mm-hmm. So if you take fear like that, the same way as you can take any emotion, you can say there's some treasure to harvest within it. It's the energy of aliveness, on the most fundamental place, but even more so on this personal level that you were just describing. It's like when you follow the energy of it, you get to see, okay, this is where I'm still stuck. This is where I have a belief that's creating pain in my life. And, you get to see that. And then kind of like the beginning of the conversation, that awareness can create a shift. Then that shift can give you more freedom from this particular variety of belief that was, so antagonizing right now. So I think, learning to see our emotions as a gift is a major feat. Maybe in general, but certainly societally, because, we're the buttoned up society.
Yep.
We're the pull it together. We're the you're too much society, and no one's teaching us. In Chinese medicine, we call it emotional hygiene.
Such a great term.
It's so funny. No one's teaching us like how to work with emotions, right? So how do you alchemize them? How do you sit with them? How do you regulate and breathe through them? Which, by the way, breathing is your number one tool. It is always the number one tool here. No one's teaching you that. So then you're the person who looks hysterical.
Right.
And, I get it. Then it feels too much for a passerby or for your friend. But then what I see happen is then those people re-traumatize this poor person who's just overflowing because there was trauma like loading their system. No one taught them what to do with it. And then everyone's like, you have a problem. You're way too much. And it's like, oh, there's no problem with anyone. It's just that these things that are loaded in our system and these beliefs and the ego mind, which we'll probably talk about in the next few episodes, it's loading it up and it's just bubbling over, right? And we don't see emotions as gifts, as treasures, as guides, as messengers. So that is good news. And, we're already probably about time to wrap up, Brooke, but I was thinking that before we close this one, I would like to maybe come back to Byron Katie and some cognitive behavioral ways to work with fear because, sometimes when I work with people, like one of the things you do with fear is you're like, okay, well, I'm so afraid. For example, let's say I'm afraid of public speaking. Like I'm afraid to get up on stage and, you would say to me, well, what are you afraid of? And I'm like, oh my God, I could get up on stage and then I could screw up. And you would be like, and then what would happen? And I'd be like, well, people will laugh. And then what would happen? It's like, well, I'd feel bad. Okay. And then what would happen? And it's like, well, I don't know. I guess I'd get over it. Or maybe my answer is not that. Maybe my answer is, and then I'll beat myself up.
Yeah. And then I'll realize that I'm totally unworthy and an utter failure. It's like, okay, well, that's what's up.
Right. So then that's what's up. So smaller fears are pretty easily shift because you realize, oh my God, my fear was so catastrophizing, but actually I've seen from the past, I'll just handle it. It'll be unpleasant. It'll be uncomfortable, but I'll handle it. Or it does come down to something that feels so painful for you. And then oh, that's what's up. Not the fear, but like I can go in by holding this belief system that I'm unworthy because that's what was fueling it, right? So then we're closer to the kind of nugget, the roots, so to speak. So maybe just a couple of words on Byron Katie, because you've had some good experience with those 4 questions you mentioned, and then we'll just link to them in the resources.
Yeah, for sure. So her first book is Loving What Is. I highly recommend it. And someone handed it to me when I was going through my divorce in the way that well-meaning people do. And in the way that people who don't want to hear it do. I was like, fuck this. Like I looked at the back and I was like, 4 questions that just might change your life. Like it sounded like exactly the blueprint stuff that I abhor. And then something allowed me to read it. And I was like, wow, this actually is this gorgeous process of really, you slow down your thoughts long enough to investigate them. First of all, to figure out what the thought is, like you were saying before about this, is the fear of public speaking, or like, what is the actual thought? What is the really raw, unprocessed, not polite thought, that you have where you don't clean it up, make it nice. You don't stamp it with the political correctness seal of approval. It's just like the raw emotion thought. Usually about stuff out there, things that are happening in your mirror. And we're doing The World as a Mirror episode. So my neighbor is a rude, aggressive slob. Okay. And then you go through these 4 questions, which I won't, take the time to totally go through, but it's, is that true? Can you absolutely know that's true? How do you react when you think that thought? And then who would you be without the thought? So it's this just like unhook by unhook by unhook by unhook, slowing down with thoughts. And then you turn them around and you see that the mirror is you. Surprise, bitch. Yeah. But it's very, very relieving. You can do it in a shame-based way, which is not what she's teaching. But if you do it in a way that just feels like, oh, this fresh air rushes into your system, it's like such good news. And it's very practical work. And we'll link to her website because she has videos of her facilitating the work with people. And then also just the 4 questions and a worksheet that you can fill out where you can say all your messy, unprocessed, icky, ooey gooey emotional stuff and go through the questions.
Yeah, I guess we can kind of cap this off with saying, we have these multiple levels to us of experience, the mind, we have the body, we have energy, we could also call it emotions. And really, epiphanies are when everything happens.
Yes.
So Byron Katie's work is very good for coming at that level of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, see how your mind is playing tricks on you.
Mm-hmm.
See what that mind is doing? Oh my God, so fascinating. Watch. And it's really freaking helpful to see how much your mind is globalizing, catastrophizing, and making stuff up. It's really, really helpful. And then we have the body, like I was describing, Rolfing, movement therapy, yoga, the thing Ann Jensen did with the movement, somatic experiencing. These levels are trying to get at it through the tissues, like release it from your cells and your soma. And then we have the energetic level. And that is embodiment practices kind of crosses both. It's like your body, but also the energy level of like how we energetically take up space, how we let emotions arise, how we see them as alchemical by honoring them with our attention and our awareness. So healing comes from all these different levels and in no particular order, in your order, whatever is ripe. But if you can hit all of these, you'll find eventually you're loosening those, like what you call it, like the nuggets, the root systems of these beliefs. Then the thoughts come last, the feelings come last, the tensions come last, So hitting it, mind, body, spirit.
Hey, boom. Now, boom. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any of the resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. If you go to the website and scroll down, you're going to see each episode in a separate post with their individual resources in there. You can also come chat with us on the social media channel of your choosing. We spend most of our time getting back to people on Instagram and Facebook, and we're Bliss and Grit at both of those places. If you want to support the show, you can write us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It helps us to know how we're doing, helps other people to find the show. If technology isn't for you, but you're enjoying the show, well, then if you can think of other people who you think might want to know that it exists, please spread the word. We would be ever so grateful. Huge gratitude to all of those who have written reviews. We now have lovely new reviews in from, I'm going to botch this word because it's an all one word, a young Swiss and Affilisk. It's the trouble with iTunes handles. But here is the really sweet one from Affilisk. Quote, I am so grateful to Vanessa and Brooke for this podcast. I'm a stay-at-home in New Jersey and have been somewhat alone on my spiritual path. My community and family aren't particularly spiritual, and if they are, it isn't something anyone ever really discusses. So I pour myself into reading and writing about the spiritual path. I'm starved for real conversation with real people about the path and my experiences and sharing the experiences of other people. This podcast has opened that door for me a bit. Hearing real women speak freely and naturally about their path is so refreshing for me. Everything they discuss resonates so deeply with me. I find myself nodding in agreement and exclaiming yes when I'm driving in my car. Such a welcome addition to my journey. Thank you so much, and we'll be back next week.